Hi, welcome. Thank you all for coming out tonight. I'm Charlotte Duran. I'm a producer here at KPCC. For those of you who are new to KPCC, we are a multi-platform organization. We're on the air at 89.3. We're online at kpcc.org. And we're in person. We do lots of events like the one you're here at tonight. We do them here and across Southern California. So if you want to find out more about the events we do, please check us out, kpcc.org/inperson. And here is KPCC's Ashley Alvarado with more ways you can connect with us.
I'm also her bodyguard. And I'm the reason that you have, because it's kind of creepy that I just followed her out here, right? But I'm the reason that you have the little piece of paper on your chair and the teeny tiny golf pencil. What I do here is I'm the manager of public engagement. That means that I am working to close the gap between our journalists and our community members. One of the ways that we do that is through these little forms, and we ask you to tell us a little bit about yourself. What do you know better than the next person? Maybe you're a parent or an educator, a botanist or a baker. Whatever you're interested in or willing to talk to about, let us know, because when our journalists are working on stories, we want to connect with you and hear what you have to say. So thank you very much for coming, and I hope you enjoy tonight.
And thank you. And just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. We are live video streaming, so we ask that you turn the flash off your cameras, but please do feel free to take pictures and connect with us on social tonight. You can connect with us at KPCC in person. We're using the hashtag early childhood. So now I'd like to introduce tonight's host, Priska Neely.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. I am Priska Neely, and I cover early childhood education and development for KPCC. We are very privileged as a news organization to have a specific focus on that, and I'm really honored to be able to tell stories about kids 0 to 5 every day, and I talk about little kids and the people who care for them and the policies that make their lives better or worse. That's kind of how I sum up my job. So you may hear me on the radio. I do these little 1-minute pieces or 4-minute pieces. And a lot of times I wonder, are people getting enough information? Are parents and educators getting the information that they need? Are they able to digest it? So that's why I kind of had the idea for this event. We do something called SoCal So Curious, where we talk to our audience about the things that they want us to cover. And I got a comment from a listener that was like, we have so many child development specialists in our own backyard. What do they think? What do they study? And what do they want us to know? And that kind of inspired me to have this particular event. So that planted the seed, and here we are today. So what we're going to do is we're going to hear from 4 local child development experts, and they're going to share some of the research that they've done or that they've heard of that's informed their work recently, and then we're going to leave a lot of time for you to ask questions in the second half. So I want to start by bringing my first expert to the stage. Her name is Tina Bryson. Tina, come on up. And I think Charlotte mentioned, but you can also connect with us if you're viewing online at KPCC in person, and the hashtag is early childhood. So Tina, thank you so much for being here. She is a psychotherapist and founder and executive director of the Center for Connection, which is right here in Pasadena. And she is also the co-author of The Whole Brain Child, No Drama Discipline, and she has a new book coming out next month, and it's called The Yes Brain. Thanks so much for being here, Tina.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
And a lot of your work helps parents to understand kind of what's happening in their child's brain, what's the neuroscience that can explain their behavior. So I think it's important to kind of step back and talk about what little kids' brains are actually capable of, because I know that's something that when I started this job, I was like, wow, there is so much more happening than I think we know. So kind of set the scene for us. What are some of the what do we take for granted and what a baby's brain can do?
So babies' brains are remarkable. And if you've ever loved a child, when you watch some of the things they say and do, it's sort of amazing that they can do what they do. And one of the reasons that they're so amazing is that in the first 3 years, more than a million connections a second are happening in that little brain, just from being in the environment, interacting in the world, interacting with us. And that is a huge piece of what happens. what is so remarkable as part of that is that what we call the regulatory circuitry. This is the part of the brain that helps us manage our emotions and make good decisions and really be able to kind of handle hard, difficult things and handle big emotions. That is really getting wired that impacts the rest of the lifespan, those first 3 years. And I'll say one other thing, and then we'll move on, is that a lot of times there's a huge gap between what parents expect and what babies can do. So while they're amazing and remarkable and their brains are changing so fast, we often expect more than what is possible. And just as a quick little note on that, 2/3 of parents believe that by age 2, children should be able to control their impulses, share, and have some self-control around emotions. But we know that that doesn't start becoming possible even in small ways until about 3.5 to 4 years of age. So, and then that's just the beginning of it. It takes well into our mid-20s, and some of you might know some adults who are working on those skills as well.
I was like, some older folks are coming to mind there too. So you mentioned that impulse control, and I know we got some questions about tantrums. That may be something that a lot of parents of little kids and educators are dealing with. Yeah. So talk a little bit about what's going on in a child's brain during those moments.
So I am so excited to talk about this. It's sort of this approach to discipline and to think about what do we do when our kids are at their worst, when they're behaving in ways that are so frustrating to us or we feel a little helpless for. And so what I want to say is that I'm going to talk about a way to think about kids' behavior and the way we respond to it that is actually very much based on research, decades of research, but very counterculture. So one of the things I want to say is that the brain is either in a reactive state or in a receptive state.
And we actually have a slide for this too.
Yep. So when we're in a reactive state, we are defensive, we act as if we're under threat. We are, just if you'll go to the very next slide for me, thank you. So the brain is either in a reactive state where we are not handling ourselves well. We are defensive and possibly even aggressive, and we're not listening to other people, but we're just in this really reactive state in our brains and in our bodies. Or we're in a receptive state. And when we're in a receptive state, we are open and we can listen and we can make good decisions. And even if we're frustrated or even if we're angry, we can still handle ourselves well. So a good way to think about this from a whole discipline lens is to think about your child's little nervous system and your own as well. So when we are in a receptive state, we call this the green zone. And you'll see here on this chart behind me that when our nervous system is well balanced, so you actually have 2 branches to your nervous system, the sympathetic, which is like the gas pedal that revs us up, and the parasympathetic, which is like the brakes that calms us down. And when those 2 are well balanced, even when things get really challenging, we stay in a well balanced state, which is the green zone. And when we're in the green zone, we are in an open receptive state. We can handle adversity well. You know those times with your kid where even you're like, oh, I'm afraid to tell them this, but they're like, it's okay, Mommy. And you're like, wow, that's amazing, they can handle that. And then there are times we're in a reactive state. So if our nervous system gets too revved up, we go into a state of kind of hyperarousal, and this is what we call the red zone. And there are physiological changes that happen in the red zone. Your muscles get tense, your eyes get wider, your heart rate increases, your breathing increases, you might get hot, or your skin might get red or splotchy. And when you're in the red zone, this is where your body and your brain says, threat, threat, threat. Even if something is really, the event is, I need you to get your shoes on and get in the car. But the nervous system goes into a state of hyperarousal, and that's where fight, flight, freeze comes on. And the opposite of that is the blue zone. And in the blue zone, it's a hypoarousal, where actually you kind of start shutting down. So you kind of go into more collapse, your blood pressure and heart rate and all that even slow down. This is where your kids kind of like collapse and shut down. Both red and blue are reactive states. So here's what I want to tell you about this. We've been told that when our kids do something wrong, we should address it right there in the moment or they won't learn. That is not true. That was actually based on really old research, mostly on animals. And what we know is that if we want our children to become self-disciplined human beings, who live in their green zone most of the time, right? To be adults that can handle themselves well. then we have to teach them how to do that. And we have to think about it this way, that a lot of kids' bad behavior, tantrums, reactivity, aggressiveness, telling you things like, I hate you, you're so stupid, and we often will say, you can't talk to me like that, which is a dumb thing to say because they can, they just did. Exactly. So here's what I want to say about this. A lot of times the worst behaviors, the behaviors that drive us the most crazy, the discipline problems, are because our children are in the red zone or the blue zone. And if we want to be effective disciplinarians, and I want to reframe that word, the word discipline actually means teaching and skill building. Our job as disciplinarians is to be teachers and skill builders. So with that in mind, oftentimes if we really need our children to learn, they have to be in the green zone. And we have to be in the green zone, right? Because the red zone's contagious, I'm sure you know. So here's what's so important, that if we want our children to learn, if we want to be effective disciplinarians so that we're giving them skills so they can handle the situation better the next time as development unfolds, they have to be in the green zone. So in the name of discipline, one of the most important things we might need to do is to soothe them and comfort them first until they're back in the green zone. And then we address the behavior and hold them accountable for the behavior and enforce boundaries and all of those things. I'll just say one other thing and then I'll pause, and that is that most of what we do in the name of discipline in this culture are things that send kids further away from the green zone. When we discipline, we ignore them sometimes. We've been told to ignore them when they're having tantrums. We've been told to put them in timeouts, which can be done effectively, but actually the way the research supports timeouts is not how parents typically do them. Usually the way parents do them are punitive and angry and sending them away from us, which is not what the research showed in terms of efficacy. So if we yell and scream, if we spank, if we punitively send them away from us, if we humiliate them, if we do these different things, it actually makes it less likely they can learn, and our discipline is not effective.
So kind of in that vein, we got a question from one of our listeners, Claudine Vosnick. She says, I have a 2.5-year-old that is bossy and determined to dictate the way things will go. Help me to not be that mean mom I see in movies. So we talked about this a little, but what is something kind of specific that in one of those bossy moments you could do to redirect that?
Yes. Okay, so this parent is asking, how can I keep from going into the red zone and being bossy, mean mom? Yeah. Okay, so first of all, a 2.5-year-old that is being bossy and asserting herself, awesome. That is developmentally exactly what's supposed to be happening. It's not fun. It's easy for me to say when I'm sitting up here and I'm not having to do it. I have 3 boys, so I have been in the trenches with you. So what I would say is, if you want your child to be cooperative, and by the way, all the bossy kind of stuff will serve her really beautifully later in life. It's just getting through this. If we want our children to be cooperative with us, we need them to stay in the green zone. One of the best ways so I think about one of our jobs as parents is to, when our kids are outside the green zone, to get them back in, and that's usually done through empathy, connection, soothing. And to expand their green zone over time so they have a nice, hearty, that's the green zone is what resilience is really all about. So what I would say is to give your kid a big, hearty green zone, playfulness, playfulness, playfulness. So if the daughter is being bossy and the mom's not wanting to be the mean mom, but she's wanting the daughter to cooperate, what I would say is silliness is your best friend. So if the child is like, you go over there, I'm going to go over here, I'm not getting in the car, I'm not putting my shoes on, and being kind of oppositional. If mom or dad can be playful and say, oh, I'm so glad you're not going to get your shoes on because I was going to wear your shoes today. Or please don't get in the car seat because my imaginary friend Herman is sitting in there today, and if you go sit on him, he's going to yell, and then I'm going to have to do that weird dance. And so to be playful. And so if she's being bossy, you can also, besides playfulness, one other thing is we can also lean into it in a way that is playful. So almost act as if you're doing role play. Not where she's bossing you around and she's in control of the family. That's not good for anybody. But to say, oh, you're being Miss bossy lady today, and be like, boss me around. And you almost do it like a role play, as if you were playing, chef and pastry cook, or whatever. So to kind of lean into for it to be a silly playfulness, maybe use a different accent or voice, and to kind of lean into it to give her sort of that experience, but where you're still in charge, which is really important, that we are still creating that safe space where they know they're not ruling the roost, because that does not make them feel safe.
A lot of creativity there.
Creativity and playfulness. And I'll say, parents will often say, I don't want to do a whole puppet show to get them to put on their shoes. I just want them to put on their effing shoes, right? But really, when we think about the amount of energy and effort we put in when we are in those battles with our kids, it's so much easier to pause, to really tune into what our child is doing in the moment and what their internal landscape and experience is, so that we can kind of hold that in mind as we're kind of knowing how to move forward. And we will spend a lot less energy if we can just be playful and silly with them. Walk funny, use weird accents.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I'm sure we'll have more questions for you later.
Thank
We're going to
you.
bring up our next guest. Thank you, Tina. So, Ashaunta Tumblin Anderson is an attending physician at Children's Hospital Los Angeles, and she's also a health policy researcher for the RAND Corporation. Welcome, Ashaunta. What such great timing getting up here.
Thank you for having me tonight.
So you do a lot of research, and we're going to talk about some health things right now. You came out with some research earlier this year on the health impacts of racism on little kids. So tell us about your major findings.
Exactly. So I did a study that was based on a survey that's done every few years by the CDC. It's called the National Survey of Children's Health. And on that survey, they asked a question of all the parents. They said, was your child ever treated or judged unfairly based on his or her race or ethnicity? And so they went through, everybody answered this question either yes or no, and in general, across the United States, about 4% of parents said yes, and it was different in different racial and ethnic groups. It was as low as about 1% among white families and white children, and as high as about 10.5% among black families, and the other groups fell kind of in between those two, so anywhere between 1 in 100 kids and 1 in 10 kids were experiencing these kinds of problems. And so the question that I asked as a pediatrician, what does this mean for children's health? You would imagine that when you experience this kind of thing, that you might have a bad feeling, you might have some anxiety, you might have some worry, some depression, that it could be linked to poor health for you. So in that same survey that was done by the CDC, they asked the children, or the parents of the children, to say if they had had poor health. And so I divided that question into people who said my child has excellent health, or people who said their child did not have excellent health. And across the board, in every racial and ethnic group that we looked at, we saw a decrease in reports of excellent health when children had also experienced some kind of racial discrimination. And we went even a little bit further than we divided it according to the different major racial and ethnic groups that were looked at. They looked at white children, they looked at African American, they looked at Latino, and then they had an other category for all the rest of the children. And regardless of which group was looked at, there was a decrease in reports of excellent health when the child also experienced racial discrimination. Second outcome that I looked at was ADHD, so attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And across the board, once again, when children had these experiences or racial discrimination reported by their parents, we saw that the reports of ADHD also increased as the parents told it.
And these were preschool age children?
And these are children, some of them were preschool age, and some of them were older. And this survey, it ranged from the ages 0 all the way through age 17. But we saw the effect even when we looked just at the preschool age children.
Wow. And one of the things I noticed in just looking it over, so children from high-income households also had the negative health effects too, right?
And we know from looking at other kinds of studies that have been done that usually having higher income will be protective of your health. But in this case, we still saw that some of the children who are from higher income families were still having a decrement in their health when they experience this racial discrimination. So a lot of times when we do these kinds of studies, there can be some confusion between, well, is it the effect of the racial and ethnic minority group, Or is it the effect of poverty and having low income? Because we know that sometimes those things are conflated, that some of our families that tend to be more minority, African American, Latino families, might also be the ones who are experiencing lower income backgrounds. So I wanted to further divide the large number of people who were assessed according to both racial and ethnic group and their income background. And so even when I did that within each racial and ethnic category, according to their high income versus low income, even the high income children were still having negative outcomes.
So this is, kind of overwhelming to hear, that it can have a health effect. So what can parents do? What strategies do you suggest for dealing with if children have gone through those experiences, or for how parents can talk to young children about race?
So this is the area where I focus most of my research. We have known for some time that racial discrimination has a negative effect on children's health down the line. And I wanted to be able to stop focusing on the bad things that were happening and start to focus on what the solution might be. What's something positive that we can focus on when it comes to racial, ethnic, and even cultural differences? And I stumbled across this entire area of science known as racial socialization. And this is a word that just means all the ways that children learn the meaning of race in our world today. And there are actually a number of strategies that are employed, and our wonderful community of social scientists have done work on this for decades, and they've shown us that there are certain strategies that can be employed that actually help children to have better health outcomes. And there are also some strategies that are tied to worse health outcomes for children, and this is something that I was particularly interested in as a pediatrician, because this is the kind of information that I want to be able to share with families who are struggling with these kinds of issues. So one of the strategies of racial socialization, or the ways that we help children to navigate race issues, is something called cultural pride reinforcement. And it is just what it sounds like it is. It's helping the child to have pride in their own cultural background. And so that's teaching them things about their heritage, about their traditions, about their ancestors, about inventors and famous people with the same cultural background. So what does this look like in the home? It's celebrating perhaps the kinds of foods or the kinds of music or the language that's particular for a kind of a cultural background. And doing this with a child over time does help to build a sense of cultural pride for them. It builds their self-esteem, and it's tied to better outcomes for most things that were looked at in general. This is mental health outcomes, this is behavioral health outcomes, and even academic outcomes are usually the outcomes that they look at across the board. Has been generally positive. So when parents and others ask me what can we do to try to help children to deal with the potential of being discriminated against, is first thing is just to build them up, to shore up that feeling of pride in their cultural background. And then a second method that's often studied in the research literature out there is called preparation for bias. And this one is one where it's kind of a good news, bad news proposition. So you level with the child and you say, there is some bad news. It is possible that you might be treated unfairly based on your racial, ethnic background, but the good news is that there are some things that you can do about it. You share some coping skills. You give them a way to prepare for what they might do if they ever find themselves in that situation. This is in contrast to another strategy that's called promotion of mistrust, where it's just the bad news part. It's just that you might be treated unfairly, so just don't trust those people. And that provides no coping mechanism. That provides no way for children to deal with the kind of anxiety or worries they might have when they're told they might potentially experience something that's negative and might make them feel bad about themselves. So the first thing I tell parents is, let's go for cultural pride reinforcement. Let's stay away from promotion of bias, because that's tied to negative mental health, behavioral health, and academic outcomes for children. And the one in the middle, preparation for bias, is something that's usually more appropriate for older children, when they can begin to understand that there is bias and there is discrimination in the world. And parents usually feel more comfortable entertaining those conversations once their children have started to have those experiences, begin to have more of that conversation.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask one question that we got from a listener that's kind of on that note. She's asking about the fact that there's a lack of diverse role models in the classroom, and there may also be a lack of diversity in children's literature. And you were talking about the cultural pride reinforcement. Do you have any ideas, for how to push through that?
Mm-hmm. So one of the areas that I'm really interested in focusing on these days is children's literature, because I think this is a great vehicle for doing cultural pride reinforcement with children in a developmentally appropriate way. So I think we can have a lot of cultural pride elements that are present in the books that we select. Now granted, sometimes it can be hard to find those diverse books and to find those books that have the cultural pride elements, but they are out there, and I've begun to work with some of my colleagues to put together lists of books that have those kinds of cultural pride elements that families can use and share with their children, and begin to just make it part of the normal routines of everyday life in the household, that we see different kinds of people reflected in the books that we read. We see different kinds of cultural traditions and heritage are reflected. We begin to understand and appreciate not only our own cultural background, but the cultural background of lots of other people who are around us. So I say one of the first things to do is to just work hard to find the books that do celebrate, various cultural backgrounds, especially the ones that are in your local community, so that your child will be knowledgeable about those. And there are online communities that are particularly interested in these things. There's one called We Need Diverse Books, where you can find lists of books that are out there and people who are working to try to get more of those books out there. On the topic of role models and who's available in the classroom setting and some of the other places where children might find themselves, I think in a lot of our professions we are working to try to increase the diversity in the settings, but where we are for right now, we want to work with who we have. I think in the early childhood education community, that they are very aware of the fact that this is important for children's development, that they think about anti-bias curriculum. And within the pediatric community, we try to think about it as well. We don't have a lot of minorities represented in the doctors that your children may see when they come to the clinic, but I think that every provider that we have can become well-versed in these same simple steps that I talked about, the cultural pride reinforcement, the preparation for bias, staying away from the promotion of mistrust, and they can be able to share these kind of guidance principles with families as well.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Ashaunta.
Thank you.
Next, we are going to bring up Joan Maltese. She is the founder and CEO of the Child Development Institute. And she is going to, we're just kind of, trying to give you a lot of different information here. So we're taking you on a little tour through child development. So, Joan, thank you for being here.
Thank you. Very excited to be here.
Yeah. So you have the Child Development Institute. So you have early learning centers in Canoga Park, and you actually do intervention services for families, trainings for teachers. And you came across a study earlier this year that kind of informed the work that you do there. So tell us about that.
In February, some of my colleagues and I went to the Sims Man think tank in Santa Monica, and the focus this year was on stress and early development and the importance of early relationships and self-regulation in being able to mitigate stress. So one of the studies that we heard really resonated with us because I don't know about you, but in our practices and in our lives, we are really hearing about people feeling under great stress these days. There's a lot of uncertainty, just really feeling challenged with that. So the topic was really timely. And one of the studies that was really spoke to us was a study that was done on parents who fight in front of their children. And shockingly, when parents are arguing in front of a pre-verbal child, that child's cortisol level, stress level, is 3 times as high as that of the adults. And you can imagine that adults who are arguing are pretty stressed, right? But the infant is 3 times greater. And this is a pre-verbal child. We have evidence that even when children are sleeping, that they are having rises in their cortisol levels when they are exposed to arguments or violence or some hostile activity in the home. So that was really alarming to us. And it's important to think that we often think that children who are pre-verbal, they're babies, they're not going to remember this. And, they may not remember that content of what you were arguing about. That's not what's important. What is important is their brains are very busy calculating every second. When we talk about that rapid brain growth, what they're doing is they are analyzing their world. Who am I? Who are you? Is this safe? Where is my safety? How do I prepare to operate in this world? And so if the patterns are that there's a lot of negativity, there's a lot of hostility, then they are learning to get ready for an aggressive and violent environment. That means their biology has to be set on hypervigilance. I need to be anticipating and looking for where that danger is, which is not what we want our children to be doing, especially early in their life. Our job is really to create safety for our children and protect them from toxic stress. And so unwittingly, very often children are put in that position. Now, as a child is older, they're able to have some coping with that. So they can even create some diversions. And a lot of times when parents are fighting, children will create a ruckus. So they'll take the parents away from the fighting and they'll get the attention on them. And sometimes that's very negative. Last year, my son and I were having a very heated conversation on something we completely agreed upon. But we were both upset about something, and we were talking about it, and we were really expressing this. And his almost 4-year-old came into the room and said, "Daddy, are you having a problem with your mommy?" And we were able to say, no, we're actually talking about something that's really important to us, and we're helping each other by talking about it. So, with an older child who has a safe relationship with their parents, they can actually ask questions about it. There's also some research that shows that parents who can argue in front of their children and actually come to a resolution, that's not a bad thing. Mm-hmm. So children are actually better prepared in relationships if they see their parents having difficult times, but they are working towards a solution, they can talk about it, and they share that. However, that's not so certain when you're arguing in front of infants, because they can't ask the question, "Daddy, are you having a problem with my mommy?" So
we're getting a lot of information tonight about how much babies know, how much they can learn, how much they can pick up, and this study in particular may be a little stress-inducing stress-inducing for parents. So you've actually come up with some suggestions on how to navigate this and bring calm into the situation. So tell us about that.
Well, it really rang for us that parents are under a lot of stress, and it's affecting their babies. So rather than just telling parents, "Gee, you're stressed out and you're fighting, and that's causing problems for your child," we really want to be thinking about how do we help parents to deal with their own stress so they can be in a place of being sensitive to their child's stress as well. We don't want to be in a position of putting another burden on parents that say, here's another thing to be stressed out about. You're not doing a good job in your parenting. So one of the things that we did is we went back to our Early Learning Center, which is a free drop-into-play center for parents and young children, and we did a survey with parents about how stressed out they were feeling, and we weren't surprised to find that the stress levels were really high, and parents reported that they were feeling more stressed than normal, and they thought it was affecting their parenting. So we started a program called CALM, which is a 6-week free program for parents and their young children, and this was for children under 1. This is just our pilot study. And we had families come weekly for 6 weeks, and CALM is, the first session is all around reading cues. First of all, your own cues. How do you know when you're stressed, and what do you do about it? And then how do you recognize the stress in your child? And then attunement, which is, that synchronicity that you have with children. And another piece of that research was the importance of having synchronicity moments and times, that dancing with your baby, singing with your baby, that kind of movement really creates a feeling of attunement and safety, and has really significant changes in the brain when you have that kind of synchronicity. And then listening was the L. Listening to your tone of voice, listening to your child's response, and then M was mindfulness. So all 6 weeks are really focused on, first, having the parent recognize their own stress and giving strategies and ways for them to get calm in the green zone, as Tina would say, and then to create that for their child in a fun and loving way. And what we found out at the end of 6 weeks is everybody wanted to sign up and keep doing it. So we will be expanding that program.
So listening, mindfulness. Say what the calm cues.
Cues, paying attention to how do you know that you're under stress and how do you recognize that in your baby. A was attunement, and that's synchronicity. L is listening to your tone. And then M is that mindfulness.
I like that. I think I could just use that at work too. My editor's there. Hi, boss. I wanted to shift a little bit to a question for you. You offer a lot of speech and behavior therapy at your centers. So we have one question that came in through our SoCal So Curious project from Mary Ellen Tan. She says, what is early intervention occupational therapy, and why is it effective in treating children with sensory processing dysfunctions and autism?
Wow, there's a lot of components in that question. So maybe we just talk about what occupational therapy is in early intervention, which is that, each of us has a different sensory profile. So some children are like orchids, and they're very, very sensitive and can easily fall apart, and sensory information can really, undo them. Other children are like dandelions, and they can really take a lot. So we're all on this kind of continuum, but there are some children, and particularly children who have autism, and I think many children who have ADHD as well, have some real challenges in their brain development in terms of how sensory information is actually integrated and coordinated so that their experience of sensory input can be very, very low, so a lot of things just don't register, or it might be really hyper-aroused so that some senses or all senses can be not only disruptive but actually painful. So you might have a child who, for other children, listening to songs might be something that would be enjoyable, but to a child who has sensory processing difficulties, it might actually be painful. You might find them under the table with their hands over their ears trying to block out the sounds. There's also challenges in just being able to kind of know where you are in space, how to plan your motor activity to get from here to the door, for instance. And so a lot of times when children have sensory overload, their response is to withdraw from the sensory experiences that are uncomfortable and often gravitate to a sensory experience that feels safe and comforting. So you will find children who are doing kind of repetitive behaviors over and over, and it's not just because they're sort of stuck on something, it's because they're doing something that feels safe and pleasurable, and they're avoiding something that feels painful and confusing. So they're not able to integrate all of those sensory components together, so it's not functional. So what an occupational therapist does is try to help them to have more coordinated sensory experiences so that they can engage in the world. And they do that in a very playful way, and they do that in a way that first and foremost includes the parents, because it's not something that can happen in an hour session a week, for instance. It has to happen on a daily basis. So parents may learn to help children to tolerate experiences that have been uncomfortable by pairing them with experiences that are really fun. So not to get too long and complicated, it's a very interesting and creative field, because there's not just a one pattern to it, regardless of what the diagnosis is, and the solution to it is very individualized.
Great. Well, thank you so much for sharing that information about stress and bringing some calm to us as well. Okay, thank you, Joan. And the last guest that we have here on our child development tour is Marlene Zepeda. She is a professor emeritus at the Department of Child and Family Studies at Cal State LA. And So what have we done tonight? We've talked about discipline and the brain, what's going on in the brain. We've talked about health effects of racism. Just talked about stress and attachment, how babies read about that. Now we're going to go to language, because you are very much an expert on dual language learners. And I just want to start with a slide here that you've provided, because we just want to set the scene for what we're talking about in California when we talk about dual language learners and how many we have.
Well, thank you for inviting me to present.
Yeah.
And I did bring the report. That's from the National Academy.
Hefty
and
report.
I think you put it on the link, right?
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
So if you're interested in a 600-page report, you can look at that. The slide behind me illustrates the number of children in the state of California who are identified as English language learners. English language learners are children who come from homes where a language other than English is spoken. And in the United States, we are ground zero for English language learners. 23 to 25% of all English language learners in the United States reside in California. For the 0 to 5 population, we actually use the term dual language learners. And that is because we feel that is a more accurate representation of what these children are experiencing, and that is they're hearing two languages either simultaneously or sequentially when they are pre-verbal all the way up into kindergarten. So one of the statistics that became available to us in the state of California within the last year was the number of dual language learners who were under the age of 5. We were always struggling to find out that particular statistic because a lot of those children are not in any kind of state preschool or any kind of system that would count them. So First Five California came out with a statistic that suggests that 60% of all children in California under the age of 5 are dual language learners. So this is a very, very large population of children, and there are people in the field. We've been working on this issue for a long time for a number of reasons. So that's just to kind of give you a landscape.
Yeah. So we can see that this is a reality. Will become more and more common in the future. So what do we know about the capacity of these children under 5 to really learn multiple languages?
Well, we've heard already from the previous speakers about the brain capacity. And one of the things about bilingualism or multilingualism is here in the United States, being bilingual is not normative. But being bilingual in other parts of the world is common. And it's very unusual when other people come to the United States that their people are not bilingual. Now, what has really brought this to the fore in a large way is the neuroscience on bilingualism. Because the bilingual brain can do a lot of other things that the monolingual brain cannot do. The bilingual brain is more cognitively flexible, and this is shown through what people call executive function. And that has to do with being able to multitask. When you're bilingual, you have to think about a concept in 2 different ways, or the label for the concept in 2 different ways. And so there's research that suggests that very young children are much better at executive function tasks than monolingual speakers. The brain is wired differently when you are bilingual because you have to process 2 different languages and 2 different sets of rules about the language. So there's cognitive flexibility. We also know that people that are bilingual and multilingual actually have more capacity for social interaction, because when you have to learn about how to interact with people with different languages, because different languages have different sets of what we call pragmatics, or the rules that govern, say, for example, eye contact, proximity to the individual speaker. a young child has to learn how to navigate that, and they begin to learn the differences. And in fact, research with infants show that bilingual babies often don't look at the eyes. They're looking at the mouths of the speaker. And so the bilingual individual has that advantage, and they become what we call more meta-linguistically aware. When you are learning, many of you probably in the audience have learned a second language. When you are learning a second language, you often use your first language as the basis to try to understand the second language. And a young child growing up who has to process 2 or 3 languages at the same time has to really use one language to inform the other language. And they become very aware of grammar and language in a more heightened way than a monolingual speaker. So there's an advantage there. Some research suggests that they're more socially tolerant because they have learned about different cultural rules that are associated with language. And so they're more aware, and that helps with their identity development. I think we were talking, one of the speakers was talking a little bit, I think it was Dr. Anderson that was speaking a little bit about ethnic socialization. Well, when it comes to children whose home language is not English, and they're growing up in an environment that is predominantly English, one of the messages that they may get from the wider society is that their home language is not okay, that it's less than. And that then affects their sense of who they are. And we know that language, the thing about language is not just about language. Language is about social connection. And that's how children make their connection to their families. And one of the issues that's involved with language development with dual language learners is language loss. Young children can lose their language their home language as quickly as 12 months. In 1 year, they can lose their language. And I know of a case where I was working in a preschool where the parents had to bring the 4-year-old in to talk to the teacher so the teacher could translate for the parents because the child was refusing to speak the home language. Language loss can have very dire psychological and socio-emotional consequences. It can tear families apart. So this is one of the negative effects of language loss. But there's 2 other important reasons for thinking about bilingualism and multilingualism as an asset and not a deficit. And that is that it is associated with reduced dementia and Alzheimer's. And this is research coming out of Canada. And it will, if the individual is bilingual and biliterate, there's research out of UCLA that suggests that they will have an economic edge when they're trying to get work. So there's a lot of benefits associated with being bilingual.
So in terms of that kind of family cohesion and the different things that can come up inside the home versus school, we have a question from a listener. She says, in a trilingual family with spouses sharing one language, what is the best way to minimize the baby's confusion and maintain family solidarity? So this is for a little child, not in school yet, but how do you navigate that?
Well, young children can understand up to 3 languages, possibly 4. It really depends on the child. We don't have that much research on trilingualism here in the United States as we do in Europe. A lot of the child's ability to understand what's going on depends upon the amount of exposure they have to a language and the quality of that language exposure. And I have been around some trilingual children, and one of the myths about bilingualism is that children will become confused, so it's better just to teach them one language. I mean, that is a very, very common myth. But the issue is, if you are exposed to 2 languages, you are going to what we call language mix. You are going to be a little, use one language sometimes and use the other language and mix the languages, because babies are into communication. They're not necessarily producing the language, but they're into trying to figure out the world around them. So if there is a little bit of confusion in terms of how do you label a particular object, that's normal for a bilingual and a multilingual child. That is normal. It takes time for the child to develop a second and third language. And that's one of the points I think we talked about earlier, was that part of the issue with second and third language development is that it takes time. It takes time. Think of a monolingual English-speaking child. How long does it take that child to become fluent in their first language? It's going to take time for a child to process two languages simultaneously. And we know from research that children who are in high-quality dual immersion programs over time will outperform monolingual English-speaking children. But there's a commitment on the part of the program and the part of the parents to have that child in that program for an extended period of time.
Yeah, I was actually talking to a colleague, a reporter here, who is thinking about whether she should go to a school that's further away,
right,
to put her child in a dual language program, and kind of weighing the benefits of that, because there's not one in her district. So, I mean, for a lot of parents, it may not be that they have a different language at home, but they may be seeking out these programs.
Right.
So what are some ways to evaluate quality, if you are making that decision, if parents are weighing that?
Well, you need to go to the school and probably do an observation in the classroom. Get material from the school and find out what their goals are for language development, first and second language development. Because I don't want to get into the weeds here, but there's different pedagogical strategies in terms of dosage. How much? Do you start them all off in the home language and little by little introduce English over time? Do you do 50-50 from the very beginning? You have programs where they'll have a teacher in one classroom speaking one language, and then they'll rotate the class to the other teacher who speaks another language the following day. So there's different ways and different approaches that people are using to promote bilingualism. So I would suggest that she would go out there and really look at that and see if she feels comfortable with that. But I do caution that one of the things that'll happen in a dual immersion program, and parents sometimes get concerned about this, is that test scores will sometimes go down before they go back up. And that's why I mentioned earlier, you need to have that long-term commitment to see the upswing at the end of that program. But because the child, think about it, you're having to understand and produce information in two different languages. So it's double the work of a monolingual in a lot of ways.
It's kind of on that overestimation point that we were talking about earlier. We have to be realistic about our expectations. Well, great. I'm sure that there will be more questions on all of these topics, so we're going to bring back everyone back to the stage. Thank you so much for sharing. You can stay put. So we have people in the audience who are ready to hand you a microphone if you have questions, so don't be shy. And if you want to give a little information about yourself, if you have a certain person that you want to ask on stage, that's fine, or we can figure out who can tackle it.
Not a parent.
Great.
Not saying, but I have some cousins who are twins, and I was just wondering if any of you guys have any knowledge about what type of changes or differences happen in twins developing together simultaneously, as opposed to having two kids maybe having one older sibling and one younger sibling, and having the younger sibling learn from the older one type of situation.
Any twin knowledge up here?
How old are they?
They're 7 now.
I mean, the one thing that's pretty obvious is that they're going through the same developmental stages at the same time. So if you have, remember I was talking about how it's typically around 3.5 to 4 where kids have a little bit more impulse control, a little bit more emotional control. So if you have a 3.5-year-old and a 1-year-old, the 3.5-year-old, depending on the day, depending on what's happening, might have more capacity to share or something like that. If you have 2-year-olds, it's going to be a really different situation. So I think that's one of the things that's one of the biggest challenges and rewards too, is that they go through these developmental stages at the same time. And one of the things that I think is a movement in education, hopefully, but also in the mental health field, is really starting to honor individual differences. And so even though they're going through the same developmental stage, they are really unique individuals whose brains and nervous systems and sensory systems respond in really different ways. And so I think the best advice I would give to the parent, besides self-care, which is probably the most important thing for any parent, but especially if you have twins, is to really kind of do that attunement piece that you were talking about, to really tune in to what is your child's internal landscape, what is their experience in the world and in the moment, and trying to do their best to really honor those unique individual differences.
Great. Other question?
I'm wondering, now you're saying myself so loud, with the arguing parents and the nonverbal cortisol, are the long-term effects, and if so, I'm a teacher, are the things that you can do in the classroom that make them feel safer and more receptive to learning?
That's an excellent question. And there are long-term effects to any consistent experiences because babies are brilliant calculators. So if they have a consistent experience of arguing at home or in any environment, maybe it's the babysitters, maybe it's even at school, they have an angry teacher. I just was talking to somebody today who told me about her piano teacher who pulled her hair when she made mistakes. And we were talking about playing the piano when you're a young child, and it's like having a second language, how wonderful that was. And she said, I hate the piano and I don't ever want to play, and my brother could play. So any adult who has a consistent caregiving role in a child's life can do harm, or they can mitigate stresses. So if a caregiver, for instance, a child care provider, an early educator, is consistent and loving and nurturing and responsive to the child, that can actually be very protective for a child, because a child can then have an experience of themselves in a safe environment, and that is really helpful so they can gain some confidence. But if their home environment is consistently hostile and negative, that certainly is going to have a long-term effect, because that's probably going to be the place where they spend most of their early years, and the stress response system is really getting wired up in the first couple of years. So in the first 2 years, the way we're going to be responding to stressful experiences is by our experience and what we've heard and what we feel, and we're going to be hypervigilant, expecting a world to be negative or abusive or hostile, or we're going to expect a world that's going to be safe and gives us confidence and that desire to move forward into it. So yes, long-term effects, and the body doesn't forget, even though you might not have a memory of the content or what that was about, your body will know this is the world that I'm expecting to live in.
My name is, I'm one of the parents of a 2-year-old, and I just had a question regarding technology. And I know the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends it at 18 months. I think it's 2 hours, but I just wanted to see what your guys' thoughts are on that.
Yeah, let's take that. Ashaunta,
So I guess it's the time for me to chime in. So I think many people are aware that there's been a recent change in the way that the American Academy of Pediatrics has given guidance around screen time. It used to be very
black and white. It used to be like through age 2, no screen time, and then screens including the television, the computer, the video game, the smartphone, the tablet, all of it. No screen time before 2, and then after 2, up to 2 hours. And so there have been some changes, and I'll tell you honestly, it's confusing even for some of the providers to understand some of those changes, because I've talked personally with some of the people who are in charge of putting the new recommendations out there. And what they've done is realize that a lot of families are still having screen time with even their young children who are younger than 2 years old, and they wanted to be able to provide some guidance around the content. So a lot of the research is coming out right now and saying that not necessarily all the content is bad and it's taking away from children being able to learn and to develop language. So for instance, the kind of content that they thought might be appropriate for the younger children, even the ones who are younger than 2, is perhaps having a FaceTime session with grandparents who don't live near, or that kind of thing, or some of the content that might be more educational. Although a lot of the literature still shows that that kind of experience of screen time is far inferior to talking to a real person and having that back and forth with someone who can respond to what the child is doing. They can begin to develop those skills in early language development. So when I counsel parents on this topic, I still lean toward the side of just talk, read, play, sing, and those first couple years are just so very important, and try not to rely as much on the screen time.
I just have one thing I want to say. I love what you just said there. And I know, like, when my kids were little, there were moments when I didn't want to use screen, but I was about to lose my mind. And I figured 20 minutes of Magic School Bus would be far less harmful than what I might, say to them in those moments. So I think just using really good judgment. But I'm concerned about children's screen time, but I'll tell you, I'm actually more concerned about parental screen time. And so I just had to take one moment to say, there's this really famous psychology experiment where it's called now I'm blanking on it, still face experiment. Yeah. But basically what they do is they ask the parent to kind of have a blank face and not respond to their infant. And what we find is that within just a few seconds, children become very much full of stress in their whole bodies, and they become very upset when their parent doesn't respond to them. And the screens that we use walking around is like a modern-day still face experiment all the time. And so really be conscientious. When you're playing with your children, discipline yourself to put your phone away. Really make sure, obviously we need them and we need to be using them, but we really need to use judgment, not just as models, but in terms of it really is something that's interfering with our opportunities to build the best social and emotional intelligence and the most optimal connections in our children's brains. And it's just so important that we think about our own screen time.
That's a great point. The still face experiment, watch the videos online. It's like heartbreaking.
Joan, can I add one piece to that too? Is the research about one of the most important things that young children are doing is imitating, and so being aware not only of how you're limiting your child's exposure, but children are watching what's going on around them. And if you're watching what's going on around you, even if you're driving, you are seeing people who are engaged in their phone or in some, video experience. Children are watching that, and very often what they want is they don't even know what they want. They just want to do what mommy and daddy are doing. So that first thing they want to do is dig out that phone, put it on, use the iPad. Before they even have language, they're wanting to imitate what's going on around them because they're striving to take in what it is you are doing. So if we don't become aware of our own actions, then you will get children who are desperate to be on their iPads and they don't even know what they're looking for.
That's a great point. Okay, next question.
Can you actually be too comforting and too attentive to a baby, to the extent where they, throw a tantrum if you're not holding them all the time, and what do you do in those situations? I mean, they need to learn some independence, I suppose, but can you be, you made the point there where you always want to get them to calm down if they are having a tantrum, but if that tantrum is because you're being very attentive and all the time, and now you need to, create some space there, and maybe it even extends to something like co-sleeping and that type of thing. But is there a danger or risk of too much comforting and attentiveness.
And Joan, you and I would probably respond similarly. Feel free to follow up too. That is a really common question. I get that question a lot. The science over decades and decades and decades is very clear that we cannot spoil our children by being too attentive, by holding them too much, by touching them too much, or by soothing them too much. And I am not at all a fan of permissive parenting where we let children do whatever they want and we let them manipulate us and all of those things. What I find is that the research is very clear that in order to be really effective at setting limits, which is what our kids need very much, we actually, if we do the soothing first, that can be much more effective. And I'll give you a really specific example. So one evening, my 4-year-old was refusing to get out of the bathtub, and he was saying funny things like, "This doesn't count as my real bath." And he was trying to come up with some logic to convince me why he shouldn't have to get out of the bath. But I did all the things I'm supposed to do, try to stay calm, give him warnings, all of these things. But when it came time for him to get out, I could hold the boundary and soothe at the same time. And the way I did that was this is just one example, is to say, in 1 minute, it's gonna be time to get out. And if you don't get out by yourself, I'm going to gently pull your body out of the tub. And if you need to cry and be upset, it's okay to cry and be as upset as you need to be. And I'll be right here with you as I pull you out of the tub. So it's not about being permissive. And one thing I want to say that I think addresses your question more directly, and that is that I think we've all been taught that we can, that if we can reinforce bad behavior by giving attention to it. And actually the research shows that that a child's need for attention is biological and primitive and just as much a need as food and sleep and all of these things. So when we say she's just trying to do that to get our attention, that'd be like saying she's just trying to drink water when she's thirsty. And what happens is if we see their bids for connection and attention as a need, then you start understanding that if we don't meet that need with attention, that they have to get bigger and bigger and bigger with their behavior. So what we want to think about is what we are giving attention to. So if my child is falling apart and doing a behavior that's not appropriate, that I want to have changed, then what I'm going to do is give attention and soothing about the feeling. Then they get calm, and then I can effectively address the behavior. So I can say, I can see you're really frustrated right now, like if they're hitting or biting or something like that. You're really frustrated right now. I can see that you're having a hard time. Come here, calm down, calm down. Once they're calm, their brain is now in a state in which they can learn, and we say, biting hurts, no biting. Instead, let's use our words, or instead, let's ask for help, or something like that.
And that would go for educators as well, because I'm sure those moments are popping up in the preschools all the time. Joan, do you want to just quickly add something?
No, well done.
Great. Okay, next.
Hi there. I had a question. As far as preschools go, I went on a tour to a major, I think it's Reggio-styled school.
Reggio Emilia.
Versus a regular preschool where they have more structure. My question is the one better than the other, or do they offer different values?
Ooh, the preschool question. Marlene?
Let me talk about Reggio, because we have that at Cal State LA. Well, it's the Reggio inspired. Reggio comes from Italy, and it is a more play-oriented focus, and it really takes us back to our roots of early childhood education, where the child had more choice. The child is able to engage in different activities. It's not what we call direct instruction. And so I think it's interesting at Cal State, when I talked to the faculty who had their children in the child development centers, who loved the Reggio approach were all the hard scientists, the biologists and the physicists, and because they saw that as really developing creativity in the child and allowing for experimentation, and that would serve them and that's what they feel that they do as scientists. So it really, I think a lot of it really depends on what the goals and objectives are of the parent for the child. I've never, I've studied early childhood for a long time. You have both this more open-ended kind of instruction and you have more direct instruction. Children need both. It just depends on what the subject matter happens to be. But the Reggio does provide that for the children. I know that some of the reaction of the parents was sometimes that, quote unquote, they weren't learning anything or they weren't getting ready for kindergarten. And so, so sometimes the director would do more directed kinds of activities, but it was more to please the parent as opposed to the children. So I think did it go off? So I think it really depends on what the parents would like to see and what the goals are for their children and what the match is between the child and the program. So that's how I would talk about it.
Great, yeah, and I've heard that a lot from just touring different preschools for work too, that a lot of directors will have parents come in, try it, see it for a while, and then may not work, may not be a good fit, but just kind of like with any other type of school. Okay, next. Okay, we're getting to you.
How would you say parents separating affects like a 2 or 3 year old child? Like if the child is with mom and then they say, I want to be with dad, and then the child's with dad and they say, I want to be with mom. Like, what do you say to that?
You mean just like in the household or,
yeah.
or a drop off or just, okay, just like preferring one parent? Or,
right,
okay.
yeah. I mean, when parents are separating and, the child is asking.
Separating out of their relationship?
Yes.
Okay. Just wanted to be clear on that. Yeah, Joan?
Yeah, I think that child is saying exactly the right thing, which is, I want to be with my mommy and I want to be with my daddy. And I think how it affects the child is how sensitive the parents are to the child's experience of that. So rather than trying to talk the child out of that experience, that difficulty, to be sympathetic to that and understand it. Children can survive that and cope with that, but it really has to do with how the parents are acting around the child and their tone and how they're treating each other. It's important to remember that your experience of your husband, for instance, is your child's father and a very important person, so they need to be treated with that love and respect because it's an extension of themselves. So it's really important, I think, when parents are having a difficult time, that they're really thinking about being their best self, you might say, and being able to be in a empathic and, I want to say loving place, a loving place of your child's mother, your child's father, for the benefit of your child. I mean, you may have your differences. That's a reason that you're being separated, but your child belongs to both of you and needs to have, and we haven't talked about this very much, but really important that fathers are thought about in terms of their relationship and that consistency. And, children will do fine in lots of different family configurations as long as they have that consistent loving care with their caregivers. So that definitely is something that parents should and could help their child to navigate that and cope with it. But but to be fair, it's not what they would choose.
Sounds like probably that calm mantra would be helpful, being attuned and listening, being mindful. Okay, next.
Hi, thank you for being here tonight. It's been very helpful. I'm a speech therapist, and I just wanted to know what the latest research was for bilingualism for kids who already have a speech delay. I do a lot of therapy in homes of Spanish-speaking parents, and so sometimes I come in and the parent's like, I want you to do therapy in Spanish, and I'm bilingual myself, and so if I see that in the home, they speak to them both Spanish and English, but the kid is not saying anything yet, and it's like 2 or 3 years old. I just want to know what's the best way to approach that, both in the neuroscience and in the research that currently came out.
Is it the American Academy of Speech and Hearing, ASHA? Basically, because a child might have a speech impairment doesn't mean that they cannot be bilingual. there's no research to suggest, and the National Academy also mentions this, that the child, just because they have a speech impediment, cannot be bilingual. And that, again, to support the home language would be helpful for that child in the long run. It's fortunate that you are bilingual and that you're able to do that, because so often there's no option for the child who does not speak English for therapy in their home language. So you could look at the ASHA regulations. There's also, I could refer you to a paper that was done specifically on special needs and, not special needs, but speech pathology relative to bilingualism. But there is no research that would suggest that they do not have the capacity to be bilingual.
And that's a good time just to mention, too, that our experts will be sticking around. If you have more specific questions, we'll try to get to as many of you as possible. So next up.
Hi, my name is Jennifer. I am a junior at Burke Corona Charter High School, and my question is regarding infants with single parents, and how does that affect their cognitive development, some short-term and long-term effects, and what can we do?
Wow, a high schooler. Thank you for being here.
Great question. You know, the research shows that it isn't whether or not you have a single mother family. The research really is on the quality of the relationships of the adults in your world. So we can have a lot of different configurations of families. Even parents who are separated, it's really important that they maintain the contact, if they can, with the father or with other family members. I think that some of the research says that you need 4 adults per child, just in terms of, and not so much because the child needs that diversity, it's because the parents need other people in their life to help to relieve the stress. It's just too much for one parent to handle. But it isn't because that parent isn't enough, it is because the parent needs that support. But single parent families are, do just as well as long as the parents have the support they need to have and the children have other adult relationships that are consistent in caring and loving to them, and so they can be of any configuration.
I have a question that's come in from Facebook from James Kim. Is there a recommended age for a child to start preschool? Is it preferred for the child to stay at home with the parents as long as possible? Who wants to take that? I feel that there is no one answer to that question.
That's a very political question, actually. It really depends on the child. It depends on what the family's needs are. Some parents have no recourse but to have their child in what I call substitute care, because after giving birth, they have to be back at work 6 weeks later. So and other people are able to stay home longer with their baby. Well, clearly we would like to see parents staying home with their baby right after birth for up to 6 months. In other countries, they can stay there for, I think, a couple of years. So there's no one answer to that question. It depends on the particular family situation and the kind of caregiving environment that child will be in if they are outside of the home.
Okay, great. Let's go to another one there.
Hi, I have a daughter. She's 3 years old, going to be 4 in February, and sleeping nap time or bedtime has always been incredibly difficult. We have always done a bedtime routine where both of us are in the bedroom and we read her 2 or 3 stories. And right toward the end, and this has been like this from the beginning, she sabotages. You turn the page too quick, she throws a tantrum. You read a page that she wanted to read, she'll throw a tantrum, run out of the room. And this has been pretty consistent for like about a year now, where just putting her to bed is impossible. And she co-sleeps with us. She'll jump into bed around 2, 3 in the morning. It takes about an hour of one of us laying in bed with her for her to fall asleep. hour and a half. So bedtime routine is incredibly difficult. I want to know what would you recommend?
Wow. Tina?
While you're thinking, I see everyone sort of looking like, who wants to take this one? Okay, one of the first things we have to think about is that the brain is an association machine. And so if something is unpleasant, like actually saying goodnight, which is a separation from parents, they might have a negative association. I remember cracking up at myself one time when I was so frustrated because I struggled with sleep stuff too. I had kids who had lots of needs around sleep time. But I remember one time I was yelling, and I was like, just go to sleep. And I realized, I kind of laughed at myself. I was like, who can fall asleep if someone's yelling at you? Who can fall asleep if someone is mad at you, right? And actually falling asleep is, remember how we talked about our nervous system and regulating our nervous system? It's really the ultimate adventure in self-regulation, of really turning everything down to go to sleep. You have to feel safe to fall asleep. The brain cares about safety more than anything else. And it sounds like you guys have been so lovely and like petting her to try to get her to sleep. One of the things that I think is a kind of a new way to think about sleep. Okay, so let me back up. So what you want to do is really kind of similar to what you've been doing, but thinking about how you're wanting the idea of falling asleep and kind of going to sleep and that whole thing to be as pleasant as possible, because then the brain will associate, this feels really good and it feels really safe and connected. So it sounds like you guys are doing that really well. One of the things that is kind of a new way to think about sleep is through a sensory lens, which we've sort of talked about a little bit today. Afterwards, I'm happy to give you a resource on the centerforconnection.org, which is my organization here. We have a little blog tab, and there's an article in there that an occupational therapist wrote about. It's like really a chart. If your child refuses this, or if your child says, I need a snack, or if your child gets up and runs, if a kid wants to wrestle, like all these things, which sensory strategies they might have and how you can meet them. Not even necessarily for kids with sensory processing challenges, but just if your child's always asking for a snack, it might be a delay tactic, but like she would say, give them something crunchy to eat like 30 minutes before bedtime, because that might meet that sensory need. So it's kind of this whole checklist to think about what sensory strategies help. And I'll just give you one other quick little sensory strategy that works for lots of kids. If you take one of those exercise balls, you know what I'm talking about, those big ones? If you have, you can try it first, lay flat on your belly and have her slowly roll the ball from your shoulders down to your feet with lots of pressure, and just sort of have her do that to you. That gives a lot of good proprioceptive work for her. And then have her lay on her belly and have you do it. Have her tell you how much pressure and how quickly to do it. But when you do that on someone, it's almost like a rolling pin, and it just releases. It's so relaxing and soothing. So think about some things like that to kind of just soothe her whole little dial down to like falling asleep. And be patient. I promise you will sleep, but it's really a lot. It's really a lot right now, so I empathize with you.
Thank you for sharing. Thanks for that question.
Hi, I have a 2, almost 3-year-old, and in his preschool, there's been a child who's been doing a lot of throwing and hitting, which they're trying to deal with, and in reaction, my child is starting to do things like hit me, and I am definitely trying to soothe and make him feel better. What is the realistic amount of time that would take to get a child beyond this, basically? I mean, what is a realistic expectation to have another child stop throwing and hitting before it's, something where I need to just take them out of the school or something like that?
Are you thinking that what's realistic in terms of the child who's doing all the hitting at school?
Actually, a bit of both.
Yeah, so I think it's quite realistic to expect that, because there's a reason behind why a child is hitting and throwing. And so hopefully he is in an environment where somebody's looking a little bit deeper than just what the behavior is and trying to understand what is going on with that child. And we have seen lots of times when there are sensory issues going on with a child and they're so uncomfortable and in pain that they may be striking out. There are also psychological things that might be going on. So I worked with a little girl whose mother had cancer and was put in a hospital, and she started attacking everybody at school. Getting down a little bit deeper into what might be going on with that child is really important. So hopefully that teacher is getting some additional support in the classroom to maybe understand maybe sensory issues, psychological issues, and that kind of thing, what the history of that is. So I think that kind of behavior can be understood and regulated. That child obviously is dysregulated, and they are expressing their pain and dysregulation in that way. And I think your child is probably also feeling that frustration and looking to you, putting that then to you to like, what do I do with this anxiety or this fear that he may be having that he's going to be hit? And so your response to him of really being understanding that he is feeling out of sorts or whatever that is, but in a very loving way, not overreacting to it, but helping him to find other ways of expressing that frustration he's having.
Okay, maybe we have time for a couple more questions here.
Hi there, thanks for being here tonight. So I have a 1-year-old daughter, and the recent headlines around sexual harassment has really prompted me to think about how to raise her to be strong, but also feel very comfortable coming to us, the parents, with incidences that she may encounter, even as small as, in preschool and through all her growth. So I'd love to hear from you in terms of what type of resources I can look to, or what kind of strategies and skills could I help instill in her so that she feels confident saying no, doesn't feel like she needs to appease anyone to do anything she doesn't feel comfortable doing.
Wow. Good question.
Well, we know that children learn best from actual experiences where they're in the middle of something and trying things, and from role modeling. So if she sees you having a voice, being respectful, standing up for yourself, that's huge. One of my favorite resources to help kids empower them to be in charge of their bodies and in charge of what's happening around them, and kind of trusting their instincts if they get an uh-oh feeling about someone. I love, love, love this website. It's called Safely Ever After, and Patty Whitfler is the founder of that website. She's actually on the west side. And she will come and even do little classes for parents and their kids, even young kids, and it's just a beautiful way to kind of give her language, because she might need to be taught some language for how she can understand and speak up for herself, and really empower her to trust her own mind and her own voice.
I could also add to that is that when I think about that along the same lines as a racial and ethnic socialization, that gender socialization is going along all at the same time, and she's learning what it means to be, a girl in the world, and how she may or may not be treated. And even very early in life, we can help children to have boundaries. Sometimes children might feel like you have to hug so-and-so, or you have to kiss so-and-so. And if the child is not interested in that, I think it's important to honor the space that they need and not feel that they need to have that kind of interaction with someone. And I also try to keep in mind when we're in the clinic and I'm seeing a family and it's time to do the full well-child check, and we do the exam. When we get to the part where we have to examine the private parts, I usually check in with the parents and say, how have you been talking to your child about these issues, and good touch and bad touch, and have you started to begin to have a conversation that you expect won't necessarily be a one-time conversation, but something that you talk about and that changes as they grow older and they become better able to understand exactly what's going on.
Just want to add that I think this is a great opportunity for us to become a little more reflective about gender identity and how we treat children from the very beginning. Some new research that's just come out shows that children, by the time they're in kindergarten, boys and girls have clear perception that girls will not be astronauts and scientists. This is kindergarten. So we are conveying this information to our children of what our expectations are of girls and of boys, and what they can achieve and what they will be. And a lot of that is unconscious. We don't remember saying to our child, you're not going to be a scientist or an astronaut, but somehow it's very consistent behavior when you ask a classroom of kindergartners, how many of you are going to be a scientist? The girls will not be raising their hands. On the other hand, if you ask that question to 4-year-olds, 3-year-olds, they're all raising their hands because they think they can. So someplace along the way, we're letting them know that we don't expect that from them.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question here.
Hello. Oh, okay. My name is Miranda. I'm an infant specialist, and I work with children from 0 to 3 from different socioeconomic backgrounds, but mainly on the lower end, and also different cultural backgrounds. So my question is actually about nutrition. How would you address nutritional advice for parents that lack resources or parents that use their culture as a way to get their children to eat?
Ashaunta, do you have thoughts there?
So I think I often try to counsel parents around nutrition. Actually, today, sometimes I have families where the children are underweight and they're going through being very picky eaters. And sometimes I have families where the children are overweight and they're eating a lot of foods that are not appropriate for them. For instance, one child today, they're going through a picky eating stage and they only want to eat cookies and they only want to eat processed foods. And so for families that do have limited means and it's hard for them to access some fresher foods or some foods that are going to be healthier, I try to keep that in mind when I'm talking to them about where they're finding their foods and steer them towards, if they need to go to a fast food place, to some of the healthier options. There are some places, so say the Happy Meal, they try to give you little apple slices or they try to give you milk as the options, and some families see that as more affordable. It's something that may fit into their lifestyles more easily if you're very busy, you're doing shift work, you don't have a lot of time to do the grocery shopping, to do the cooking at home, to do the cleaning up after the cooking. So I just try to meet parents where they are and also take into consideration the cultural background of families. And a lot of times the families that I work with, they do want to make home-cooked meals and they might have certain foods that are important for their families, but they might feel that the children are going through stages where they're just not interested in those foods. So I usually try to share with them just some tips for how do you help picky eaters to eat different things. So you can cut it up into different shapes, you can put it in different sauces. There's a number of different tips that you can try to get to help children to eat the right foods.
Well, thank you all so much for all of your questions, for opening up about what you're dealing with at home. Really appreciate that. We've shared a lot of information tonight, so I just wanted to ask each of you, you don't have to do it if nothing comes to mind, but we've talked a lot about stress, and I know parenting comes with a lot of worrying. So if you want parents to walk away with something tonight that's a little bit reassuring, what do you want to say to them? Tina, let's start with you.
So this is an easy one for me, and you and I might have the same one, but longitudinal research has shown that one of the most important predictors for how well kids turn out, no matter what we're measuring it on, is that they've had what's called secure attachment with at least one person. And secure attachment is a natural inborn instinct that mammals have, where that when we are in states of distress, we go to our attachment figure or the person who will help us feel safe, connected, and protected. And what's really cool about this is that what this means is that we don't have to be perfect as parents. We can mess up all the time. We don't have to know exactly what to do in a specific moment. The research shows that if we help kids feel, and I'm going to say 4 S's now, safe, seen. Seen is really what we've been talking about, like, I can see you're having a really hard time. You sort of see what their internal experience is. Safe, seen, soothed. I'm right here with you. And secure, meaning predictably, you can count on that most of the time I'm going to see and respond to your needs. Safe, seen, soothed, and secure. If you can do that, the research shows about 30 to 40% of the time, you will have a child that is beautifully, securely attached to you. And it's one of the most important things that we can do to predict a child really doing well in the world. So basically the idea is showing up, seeing and responding to needs in really sensitive, predictable ways as best we can.
Great.
So in response to that question, I would just think about the hard thing to deal with is that bias does begin early in life, and children as young as 3 years old may be already starting to internalize bias along various lines, including racial and ethnic backgrounds. But what's encouraging for me, what I'm really excited about right now, is that there's more of a dialogue that's going on right now about these kinds of issues. And instead of just the conversations that are happening in private homes and other places of parents, I think at this time right now, especially minority parents, are very worried about children who are growing up in a world where they have to face some racial discrimination. I've even had parents who are not minorities who have these concerns and wondering how can they help their own children. What I'm encouraged by is that more and more that there are systems of care out there where they're having these discussions and they're trying to be systematic about the ways that they address these issues. And I'm proud to be a pediatrician in the American Academy of Pediatrics, where we're just now starting to convene a task force that's specifically focused on addressing bias and discrimination along a variety of lines of racial and ethnic background, religious backgrounds, gender identity, sexual orientation, the whole gamut. And we just began to meet a couple weeks ago to talk about what kinds of recommendations we might have for providers who are working with families, what kinds of strategies we might be to offer to parents and others who care for children who might be facing bias or discrimination of some sort. So we're already working on this, we're going forward, and this is going to be something that happens on a national level. So there'll be more support. There won't just be the elephant in the room or the thing that's pushed in the closet that parents are secretly having anxiety about. You're going to have a partner, in pediatric offices who can help you move through this issue.
Yeah, I guess I'll fold into that question, if it's either what do you want the audience to step away with, or what are you looking forward to, in research? What are you looking forward to learning more about?
Well, I want to say something to the audience and to parents, and that is that, one of the things all parents want is to protect their child. I've never met a parent who didn't want their child to have that wonderful attachment and that loving relationship. But it's really hard to convince parents sometimes that you have to take care of yourself. It feels like you're doing the right thing as a parent when you are so self-sacrificing. And sometimes, and we work a lot with parents who have children with special needs, and they will give up everything for their child. But if you really deplete your own resources and your own ability to stay calm and regulated and finding joy in life and really being in a place where you are exuding pleasure so that your child is picking up the joy that you have in living and in being with, then you're not doing the justice to yourself and your child. And children do bring us joy, but you have to do some work on yourself to create that space. So I think that's a really hard message to convince parents of, but it really is, you have to take care of yourself to be able to give that to your child.
So is this on?
Yeah.
So let me bring up the rear. Right now I'm very excited about what is going on from a policy perspective in the state of California with regards to children who come from homes where English is not the home language. The State Department has put out an English language roadmap. The school districts can use extra funding through the governor's local control funding formula to direct funds, and that could include preschool. We have a huge initiative coming out of First Five California focused on the DLL population. And in November, we passed Proposition 58, which is called the EDGE Initiative, or the Education for Global Economy, because the master plan for education here in California says that we are a multilingual and multicultural society, and that is an asset. And so we have a number of policy fronts that have come together, and I think it's a real tipping point for the state of California actually to lead the nation on this issue of educating dual language learners and promoting dual immersion programs.
Well, thank you all so much. We have such a wealth of knowledge up here on this stage. Thank each and every one of you for being here and for sharing your expertise. I also want to give a special thank you to the KPCC in-person team for being here and making sure all of your questions were asked tonight. We hope you'll stay in touch with KPCC and stick around. If we didn't get to your question, our experts will be here for a little bit. And thank you all so much for coming out on this Tuesday night and being with us. Thank you.